We are officially halfway through the first round of the NBA playoffs, and the narratives are already starting to form. Every single year, the playoffs completely change how we look at players, teams, and even entire franchises. A player can spend 6 months putting up great regular season numbers, but one bad playoff series can shift the conversation around them overnight. At the same time, role players that nobody really paid attention to throughout the entire regular season suddenly become household names because they step up when the lights are the brightest. And honestly, that is why I love playoff basketball so much. Not even just for the games themselves, but because this is one of the few times where everybody is playing real minutes. With real stakes attached to them, teams start to shorten their rotations, weaknesses start to get exposed, and players are forced into roles that actually matter for winning basketball. There's no preseason hype, no training camp clips, and there's no wait until next year conversations when it comes to these players and games. This is where we get to see who can really contribute when every single possession matters. And through these first couple of weeks, I think we've already learned a lot about the direction of the league, which young players are actually ready to take the next step in their careers, and which teams might not be as far away as people originally thought. Now give me a second, this one's been brewing up for a couple of months. Welcome back to the corner. Now that the season is starting to finally wind down, we're entering the final couple of weeks. We're entering that part of the year where the real fantasy basketball conversations begin. The playoffs are exposing rotations, role players are stepping up, and we're already starting to get a glimpse of what next season could look like from a fantasy perspective. Hopefully you guys were able to pull through and win the leagues this year. I've seen a couple of comments saying that they did pull through. Unfortunately, I did not. I came up short, came in third place. But if you're new here, hi, my name is Stu, and this is your #1 destination for all things fantasy basketball related. I cover fantasy news, player value, breakout candidates, and everything else in between and around the league. So if you've been enjoying the content on the channel, consider subscribing and joining the corner. Now let's get into the video. Now, every single year, people think that the best time to start prepping for fantasy basketball is right before the season starts during the fall. But honestly, I think that's way too late. The best time to start looking at fantasy basketball is right now during the playoffs. There's no more fantasy basketball. All you have is just playoff hoops, and the players are going crazy. This is the perfect time to start scouting hidden gems, younger players stepping into bigger roles, and struggling players starting to figure things out. And even guys who could end up on completely different teams next season. Because in my opinion, playoff basketball tells you a lot. Rotations start to get tighter, coaches stop experimenting with the lineups, and players are forced to earn their minutes. This is where you start to see which role players are actually trusted, which young guys are ready for expanded opportunities, and which players are quietly building momentum heading into the next season. So today, we're going to go over a few players whose roles have really expanded during these playoffs or who have just been playing lights out. And heading into the next season, I think these are the guys that could have significantly bigger fantasy value when people realize that right now. And one of the teams that really stood out to me during this playoff run was the Toronto Raptors. They were already one of the youngest teams in the league during the regular season, but these playoffs really gave some of their younger players a real chance to step into bigger roles. And one of those players was Colin Murray-Boyles. Coming into the year, there honestly wasn't a lot of opportunity for him to consistently see the floor. The Raptors already had the rotation pretty set coming into the year, and he was mostly fighting for backup minutes. But once Jacob Poeltl went down and started missing some time, that completely opened up the door for Murray-Boyles to start to see the floor, to get meaningful minutes. And he really took advantage of the opportunity earlier in the season. Throughout the season, I brought him up a couple of times. As you guys know, if you've been watching the channel, he was one of my favorite pickups from week to week. Because even in his limited minutes, he was producing at a really solid level, especially towards the end of the year when Toronto was pushing for that playoff positioning to get out of the play-in. And now that we've seen him in playoff basketball, I think he is going to be one of the biggest dark horses for fantasy next year. When you watch how Toronto is using him, his role, in my opinion, is pretty clear. They want him crashing the boards, playing physical basketball, getting high efficiency looks around the rim, and bringing energy every single possession when he's on the court. He's not a player that needs the offense built around him to produce fantasy value. And honestly, those are usually some of the best late round fantasy players because they contribute in multiple ways without needing super high usage. And at the same time, I still think there's another level that he can reach for this player. Looking at that first round series, especially in game 7, he only played around 24 minutes in a do or die situation. And to me, that says that Toronto still sees him as a developing player, not someone that they can truly trust right now or force him into a bigger position. But honestly, that's exactly why I'm interested in him for next fantasy season. The talent is already there. It's obvious. His role has grown throughout the entire year. And assuming that this roster doesn't change dramatically over the summer, I really think that Murray Boyles could be a player averaging somewhere around 30 fantasy points per game next season, especially if those minutes start to creep closer to the 20 to 30 minutes per game range consistently. Next on this list, and if you've seen the thumbnail, you already know that he was going to be mentioned at some point in this video, that is going to be Cade Cunningham. He is another player that I think we learned a lot about during these playoffs so far. Cade has been intriguing ever since he entered the league, but this season was really the first year where he became a true first round fantasy pick across almost all leagues. And honestly, he showed exactly why he deserved that kind of value. But this is also the first time in his career that he started to get real playoff minutes with actual expectations attached to him and his team. Now, that first round series against the Orlando Magic, it almost turned into a complete disaster for Detroit, one of the best teams all year, and they almost lost to the Magic in a very embarrassing fashion. And Cade showed flashes of why he can eventually become one of the best guards in the league. The scoring ability is obviously there. He can get to his spots whenever he wants, and even on nights where the jumper isn't falling, he still finds a way to impact the game offensively. But at the same time, and this has been one of his biggest issues since he came into the league, the turnovers are a major issue. There are just too many careless possessions that turn into easy opportunities for other teams, especially in playoff basketball, where every single mistake that you make gets amplified. That's probably the biggest weakness in his fantasy profile right now. Even with that flaw though, Cade is still going to be one of the top fantasy guards heading into next season because the overall production from Cade Cunningham is just way too valuable. And honestly, the biggest thing that has stood out to me during this playoff run has been how aggressive he has been attacking the basket and drawing fouls. During the regular season, he only had 13 games out of 64 where he attempted double-digit free throws. And out of those 64 games, I honestly think, if I remember correctly, it was about 22 games where he attempted more than 8. That is an insane stat. But in the playoffs, out of the 10 games the Pistons have played, he's already attempted double-digit games in 5 of those. He's getting downhill more, forcing contact, and turning that aggression into easy points at the line, which is huge. And when it comes to fantasy basketball, having a player that can consistently generate efficient free throws is huge for the stability of a fantasy team. That kind of production is way more reliable than a player who only survives off of the hot three-point shooting or rebounding numbers. If Cade can carry this level of efficiency and aggression into next season, especially at the free throw line, his ADP is going to rise even higher than it was this year. And because of that point, looking at a player that can realistically push around a top 10 or 11 fantasy value consistently next year. Another player who honestly surprised me a lot this year, and I knew he was going to be very good coming to the league, but he just really surprised me, and that has been Dylan Harper. Dylan Harper had a fantastic first season in the league, and that confidence has continued right into the playoffs. Now, from a fantasy perspective, the numbers haven't completely exploded yet. He had some streaky moments, some good moments, but the flashes have been there all year long, and now we're starting to see him in meaningful playoff minutes. The biggest thing that stands out to me with Harper is his defense and his shot selection. For a younger guard, he plays with a lot of control and doesn't really force bad and stupid shots or possessions, which is something that usually takes rookies a couple of years to figure out in the NBA. Looking ahead to next season, even on a completely loaded San Antonio Spurs roster, I think his role is pretty secure and that it honestly might be able to expand even more depending on what they do with De'Aaron Fox. And if the Spurs make a deeper playoff run this year without making too many roster changes going into the offseason, Harper is going to become a significant part of this rotation moving forward. Honestly, I think he's the type of player that people are going to overlook during fantasy drafts because there's so much talent on the Spurs roster. And by the middle of the season, everyone is going to wonder, how did they let him fall so far? I would comfortably take him before the 7th round next year, depending on how this season ends. But Dylan Harper is going to have a large role next year. Now, one of the most underrated players in this video and pretty much from the entire season has been Ayo Dosunmu from the Minnesota Timberwolves. Heading into the season with the Chicago Bulls, he was pretty much unheard of during draft season. He didn't have a lot of hype around him. Ayo was solid pretty much all season long in Chicago, but because of the inconsistency in his role and the direction the Bulls were heading, he ended up going undrafted in a lot of fantasy leagues to start off the season. But looking back now, that was 100% a mistake. I don't think next season suddenly is going to launch him into the stratosphere for ADP, but I do think he becomes a player that is getting drafted consistently in most leagues. He would not go undrafted in this next year. So far during the playoffs, his output has been outstanding, and overall his impact for the Minnesota Timberwolves has been huge, especially with Dante DiFrancesco going down. He's bringing energy defensively, making smart decisions with the ball, and giving the Wolves exactly what they needed off the bench. He's not forcing shots or trying to do too much. He's playing winning basketball and playing within his role, which I think is going to be huge as a late round pick next year. And with Dante expected to miss significant time with the Achilles tear, that opens the door even more for Ayo to keep growing in his current bench role for Minnesota. Even if he's not starting, the opportunity and minutes should be much more consistent. And for fantasy basketball, this consistency matters a lot more than true opportunity. I think Ayo is going to end up being one of those late round guards next season. And honestly, I think it may be like a round 12 or 13 type pick. But that quietly gives you solid production every single week while most people overlook him on draft night. And if he does go that late and he does play well, that could be a good person to pair with a trade. You'll get somebody else up in the top half of drafts. Now, the last player that we're going to talk about today is going to be VJ Edgecombe. Now, for a rookie, he came into the league pretty much dominating. He was drafted late in pretty much every single fantasy league, like around 10, around 11. But after the first couple of games in the regular season, his value absolutely exploded. And honestly, I think that trend is only going to continue heading into the next year. What really pushed his stock up even more was his play during the first round series against the Boston Celtics. The flashes were so obvious that we all know that VJ Edgecombe is going to become a superstar. It's just a matter of time or how long it takes for him to truly unlock his potential. The athleticism, the confidence, and the ability to create offense is already all there. Now it just depends if Tyrese Maxey and VJ Edgecombe can combine together and make that 76ers team a true problem in the East. Looking ahead to next season, I think his role is going to expand a lot during his sophomore year, especially as the 76ers start shifting into a younger core centered around Tyrese Maxey, and also assuming that Embiid gets back into rhythm and Paul George takes a smaller role offensively. That opens up a lot of opportunity for Edgecombe to become a major part of the offense. And last year he was going, like I said earlier, like 10th, 11th, sometimes 12th round in a lot of the drafts. Now, I would not be surprised at all if he jumps up to that 6th or 7th round this year. Someone truly may even reach and get him in the 5th, but I think a 5th round pick is way too expensive for VJ. But 6th or 7th, I think that would be his perfect range. And honestly, playing alongside Tyrese Maxey is probably the best thing possible for him for his development. Maxey has already made that next leap into being a superstar in the NBA. And with those two combo guards together, I think that VJ's sophomore jump could be huge, especially when it comes to fantasy basketball. The NBA playoffs still have a couple of weeks left, and honestly, it's going to be really exciting to see how all this plays out for the remaining teams. Every single year, the playoffs create new stars and completely change the value of certain players heading into the fantasy draft season. And I think that we're already starting to see that happen right now already. A lot of players are making names for themselves on the biggest stage possible. And honestly, that's something that makes the NBA so great compared to other sports. So if you enjoyed this video, don't click off just yet because YouTube thinks that you'll enjoy the one that's currently on your screen right now. In that video, go over even more fantasy basketball takeaways and players that could explode in value heading into next season. So if you're already preparing for your draft now, that's the perfect video to watch next. As always, thanks for stopping by the corner. Peace.